Hey gang, and welcome to another exciting episode of Biology Online. And today we're going to talk about photosynthesis, photorespiration, cell respiration, and fermentation. But before we jump into all of it, we're just going to do a quick overview of photosynthesis and cellular respiration. And so when we start off with photosynthesis, one thing I like to point out is that all of this is based on getting energy from our environment into living organisms. And the easiest way that we know that this happens is the process called photosynthesis, where photons of light are absorbed into a plant essentially, and that energy is stored inside of a molecule called glucose. So we start off with a particle of light, and just so you know about a little bit about light, so light comes from the sun. Photons are actually generated in the center of the star, and stars are massive, and we know that they're very dense on the inside. And so when a photon of light is created, it actually takes it about 1,000 years to get out of the sun, because it's just bouncing around like a ping pong ball inside, or inside of a pinball, inside of a pinball machine. It's just bouncing around a bunch, and eventually it makes its way out through the corona of the star, and it launches itself out into space, and in just a matter of 8 minutes, it travels 93 million miles. And some photons will actually encounter as a little blue speck, a little blue-green speck, and that's planet Earth. Hits our atmosphere, it slows down just a little bit, and then it smacks into a plant. And it's going pretty fast. But the plant is able to absorb that photon into its chemistry and then store that energy in a molecule called glucose. So first of all, let's look at the process of photosynthesis, the overall concept. So we always like to start with the equation. So don't necessarily worry too much about all of the chemistry that's going on. Just think in layman's terms. What do plants need? What do they take in? Well, we know we've got a water plant, so we know water is going to be there, so that's our H2O. But we also know they need something from the air, and specifically they need the carbon dioxide from the air. And so that gives us our CO2. What this means is this is a yield sign, so this is a chemical reaction. Here's the reactants. This is when they react together, they're going to give us the products. It's important to point out that you can't just put water and carbon dioxide together and it's going to give you these things. There's some other things you're going to need. First of all, you're going to need light. The second thing is you're also going to need, some people will put chloroplast, or they'll put chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is the pigment that absorbs the light. Chloroplast is the organelle that holds the pigment. But you'll need those things in addition to all this other stuff. You've got to have a plan. And what we're going to get out of that is two things. One is oxygen, because we know plants give off oxygen, so that's a byproduct of photosynthesis. And the other thing is going to be a molecule of glucose. Keep in mind that glucose is a fairly large molecule compared to the other things that are come in. C6H12O6, organic molecules exist in a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. So for every 1 carbon, you could have 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. So C6H12O6. But then we have to go back and actually balance the equation, because it takes 6 carbons just to make 1 molecule of glucose. So the only place we're getting carbon is right here. CO2 only has 1 carbon, so we would need 6 CO2s in order to make 1 molecule of glucose. And when we apply those numbers and we start to balance the rest of the equation, we know, some people call this the devil's equation. Everything gets a 6 in front of it except for glucose. So it takes 6 carbon dioxide, 6 waters, and in the presence of light and the chlorophyll, that will give us 6 oxygens and 1 glucose. So why is that equation important? Well, obviously it has its chemical implications, but also for us, we're just going to use it kind of as a template to look and see, and we want to account for these reactants, and we want to account for these products as we go through the rest of our notes. So normally I'd give this out as a packet, and I would write this out, and you would fill it in with me as we go. But I've kind of put it into a PowerPoint and done some animations with it. You can find the animations, PowerPoints in Canvas in the modules. So this is stuff you'd essentially be writing down. So to start us off, what's the first thing we got to have? Well, we've got to have the chloroplast before we do anything else. We got to have the organelle that holds the chlorophyll, and then once we do that, we need sunlight. So this whole process starts with a photon of light. Water brings something up from its roots that happens to be really good at absorbing sunlight, And that, as most of us know, is water. So water and sunlight are going to come into the equation for us to start off. If you've ever been in the ocean or in a pool or even just a big body of water, and when you dive in and you look across, you can see that it's light on top, but it's dark further down. Well, water is, some people think like water is like translucent, right? Like a bottle of water, you can see straight through this. But when you get a lot of water together, it has more of an effect because water can absorb sunlight. It's one of the things we covered when we talked about the properties of water, how it adjusts the environmental conditions in areas that have large bodies of water, mediates the temperature and so forth. So water can absorb sunlight. So as this goes in, the water will absorb, and it acts like a catcher's mitt, and it catches the sunlight. The hydrogens actually do the catching. The oxygen isn't really needed. So the oxygen breaks off of the water molecule, and it is given off. It is a byproduct. You can think of it as plant farts if you want to. It's not something that the plant really needs at this point in time. And so oxygen is the byproduct. So what's really going on though in this area? We said the hydrogens actually do the absorbing. So here's a hydrogen. There's the hydrogen, which is the H, which has got the proton on it, and there's the E in a circle. That's going to be our electron. There's not much difference from a photon of light and an electron. They're both just packets of energy. So the photon will actually merge with the electron, and it just excites the electron. It gives it a little bit more kick of energy. That makes it spin a little bit faster, and that makes that hydrogen slightly unstable. So the rest of this process to make the glucose is going to be trying to find a molecule, a form that we can store that hydrogen in that's going to be stable. And the end result will be glucose, which will store those hydrogens. It can store 12 hydrogens, as a matter of fact. So it's a very good molecule, and it just keeps them stable. So again, when this happens, we got that hydrogen with the excited electron. All of this is occurring in one particular part within the chloroplast. In order to actually turn it into glucose, we need to move it someplace else for another reaction to happen. It's kind of dangerous to move an excited, unstable hydrogen, so there is a molecule that will actually move this, and it's called NADP. When you add the hydrogen to it, it becomes NADPH. I kind of show this as like I call it a carrier molecule, because it literally will carry that hydrogen and its excited electron to some other place. And what does that for us most of the time? Well, UPS, right? So UPS truck is going to be our NADPH. So that will actually pick up the hydrogen and transport it from one area in the chloroplast to another area so that a different cycle can happen. But there's something else that's going to be made during this process, and that's going to be a little bit of ATP. Now, ATP, that's the energy that organisms run on. We don't have wires that move around our body to deliver energy. We have batteries that float around our body to give things energy. ATP is that battery. So we're getting a little bit of energy. We're getting the NADPH, and we're making a byproduct, which is going to be oxygen. And this is all just from water and sunlight. Because this reaction will not happen without sunlight, you've got to have it. We call this the light-dependent reaction, plain and simple. All right. So let's move on to the next process. Where's this ATP? Where's this NADPH? Where's it going? What's it going to do? Well, the first thing that happens is in order to make glucose, right? Because we've accounted for the water, we've accounted for the oxygen that's coming out. We haven't looked at the carbon dioxide, we haven't looked at the glucose yet. But in order to make glucose, we have to have carbon. Well, where's the easiest source of carbon? It's going to be the air, from CO2. So carbon dioxide is taken in by the plant. That's going to be our source of carbon, and it's also our source of oxygens. And in this process, these are all added together. The hydrogen is dropped off, all right? The carbons, the oxygens, and the hydrogens combine together into a molecule called glucose. Glucose C6H12O6 and all of the hydrogens, as you can see, that are on the glucose molecule are excited. They're carrying that extra energy that when they absorb that photon of sunlight. And you see the glucose is moving a little bit slower. That's because it takes 2 turns of the cycle to make one glucose molecule. And we call this cycle, we call it the Calvin cycle. It's also called the Krebs cycle. Excuse me, no, it's not. It's just called the Calvin cycle. That's something else for later on. And the reason why I call this the Calvin cycle is because this is named after the guy who discovered it. His name was Melvin Calvin. They said, like, what should we name our kid so he doesn't get beat up in school? We shall call him Melvin Calvin. I don't know if he did get beat up in school, but Melvin Calvin. So that's essentially the parts that we can account for everything now in our equation, but there's something else missing. The light-dependent reaction needs a couple extra things in order to really happen. What happens with the ATP once its energy is used to drive the Calvin cycle? Well, ATP will always and forever break down into ADP and a phosphate. So that's going to come out of the Calvin cycle, and it's going to be reused in the light-dependent reaction. Will be recharged into ATP. Well, what about the NADPH? When it drops off the H, you're just left with NADP. NADP will come over and be reabsorbed into the light-dependent reaction and had another hydrogen added to it to become NADPH. And this cycle goes on and on and on and on, as long as there's sunlight. Because what happens when there's no light? Well, you can't photosynthesize. Some plants have a slightly different way of handling it, but for the most part, this is the process of photosynthesis. So there are two major reactions that are going on, or two major processes. The first one's the light-dependent reaction, and it produces two things that are needed for the Calvin cycle, and that's ATP, so a little bit of energy, and NADPH. And again, NADP is carrying the H, and that hydrogen has the excited electron that's carrying the energy from the sun. Those two products are used to drive the Calvin cycle. So the Calvin cycle, at the end of it, produces NADP and ADP and a phosphate, which all go back over and be used in the light-dependent reaction. So we've been able to account for everything that's in our equation. We've got our carbon dioxide, we've got our water, right? We've got our oxygen coming out, and we've got our glucose coming out. But this is the way that equation would actually occur in reality and in the plant, anything that photosynthesizes, because plants aren't the only thing that photosynthesize. There's some bacteria, blue-green algae, for example, that actually photosynthesize as well. So let's look at the anatomy of a chloroplast, right? So the site of photosynthesis, where are these things happening? So this is a chloroplast, right? And you'll notice that it's got an outer membrane, therefore it has an inner membrane, and there's a space in between full of some stuff called an intermembrane space. Wow, those scientists are really trying to confuse you on these membrane names, right? And inside of this, where everything else is floating, there's a liquid called the stroma. And that's going to be something we're going to come back to quite a few times. Now, what's the other stuff that's going around in here? Well, you have these big stacks of green pancakes, and each individual pancake is called a thylakoid, and an entire stack of them is called a granum. So one of the things that students will often ask me is, why are they in stacks? Well, think about it. That's the thylakoid, that's where water is going to absorb that photon. And how fast was that photon traveling? Like almost the speed of light, so it's going fast. And for most leaves, you can hold them up and put them in between you and the sun, and you can see light comes through the leaf. So not all light gets captured by the leaf, because leaves are pretty thin and the photons are going fast. By putting the thylakoids in stacks, you're kind of giving the plant a better opportunity to catch that photon, because it's thicker. And it kind of slows down the photon a little bit, and it's more likely for the water to be able to capture and absorb that photon. So that's why they simply occur in stacks. Then you've got this thing called lamella, which just holds the stacks in place, holds them together so they're not moving around too much. And then you have this another fluid substance that's inside of the thylakoid, and it's called the lumen. And that's going to be important. The lumen and the stroma are going to be kind of very, very important as we start talking about the actual process for the light-dependent reaction. So where does the light-dependent reaction actually going to take place? And the answer is, it's the thylakoid membrane. So it's this thin area right here that surrounds the thylakoid that separates the lumen from the stroma. That's where the light-dependent reaction takes place. So then where does the Calvin cycle take place? Because remember, NADPH had to carry that hydrogen over to someplace else for the Calvin cycle to take place. So that's going to be out in the stroma. So the thylakoid membrane is where the light-dependent reaction happens, and then the stroma is the site for the Calvin cycle.